Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who will share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. All right, welcome. Our guest today is Brett Whalen, who is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Brett and I have known each other for a very long time. We work on kind of similar stuff. And so it's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. Welcome, Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for having me.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. So, as you were saying earlier, I never did invite you on the old webcast Drinking with Historians, and so I hope you will forgive me. This will make up in some way for it. So,
yeah, but we're not drinking, so.
Well, I mean, this is a podcast. Nobody knows that.
That's true.
So, even though it is,
who knows what's in this orange juice I'm having right now? It could be a mimosa.
Right. That's right. It's always a party on American Medieval. That's not my tagline, but maybe it should be my tagline. Anyway, so we'll just kind of start off. This is kind of the generic starting question that I like to ask all of my guests, and it involves time machines.
Oh, good.
Because I know that historians have kind of, well, at least I think most historians have kind of complicated relationships with time machines, right? Or complicated attitudes towards time machines, I should say. Okay, but for the moment, let's pretend that you, Brett, have a time machine. You get to go back into the past, but you're going back into the past to tell a childhood version of Brett Whalen that someday you're going to grow up to be a medievalist. How does child Brett Whalen react to that news?
Probably, what's a medievalist? Would be the first thing. I think Brett Whalen, childhood, though, would be, once I explained what I meant, would be excited because I still remember taking a book out on Charlemagne from the kids' library, the children's library, the Kellogg Hubbard Library, shout out, Montpelier, Vermont, Children's Library, where they had a book on Charlemagne that I think I looked at when I was like 8 years old.
Okay.
It was one of these books for kids with lots of pictures and larger font. There was also a book on how to make castles out of paper mache that I thought was pretty cool. I remember that book quite well.
Okay. Did you make a paper mache castle?
I sucked at it. I tried, and they looked so good in the book, the sort of diagrams. And mine, I think I started out with this like Roman fort that kind of went through historically, and it seemed like the easiest one to build. And I never got past the like simple Roman encampment that would have been out, out in like Germania somewhere. So I never graduated to the like large, 12th century style castles. But I think the young Brett Whalen would be like, cool.
Okay, but well, I want to know if you've ever mastered paper mache castles yet in your career. Have not? No. Okay,
no.
Well, that's fine. So it's something to work on, right?
Yep.
So I mean, the career
aspirations.
Still continues. Aspirations. That's right.
So I thought, if I may, you were going to ask me, because I thought about this before. Is can I ask you a question right away? Because I thought the question was going to be, where would you go with your time machine?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, we could get to that.
Circle around back to that. Yeah,
we could circle around back to that. But I mean, let's do time machines. That's totally fine. So flipping the script here, asking the host the question. So I've said this before on other episodes, but I mean, the first thing I would do with the time machine actually is I would probably in reality destroy the time machine, because the idea of traveling to the past is just like not an exciting thing for me. I like indoor plumbing and heat and vaccines and things like that. I think those things are pretty great. Not to say that people in the past couldn't live full, rich, enjoyable lives, but still not for me. But as far as the Middle Ages go, I think there's a couple kind of things, and they involve those lovely moments in our research in which we're just not sure what happened because the sources just can't tell us.
Plenty of those moments,
especially in the Middle Ages, right?
Yeah.
But I think in all history, that's always the case. There's one from earlier research which still kind of interests me, is the Council of Clermont in 1095.
Yeah.
I would love to know what Pope Urban II actually said, the thing that kind of launched the First Crusade, the speech that supposedly launched the First Crusade. That, I could just kind of maybe blend into the crowd and just kind of listen in the back, really put my oral Latin to the test at that moment.
I like it.
But the other one, too, is one from my recent book with David Perry from Oathbreakers, in which we talk about, like the plug there. There you go.
Yeah. Nice work.
There's a council at that moment, right towards the end, right before before the Civil War breaks out, in which things really seem to be going Louis the German, one of the sons' ways, one of the sons of Louis the Pious's way. And then there's a council in which he and his dad, Louis the Pious, have this immense falling out, and it leads immediately to Louis the German going on revolt, Louis the Pious changing his entire imperial policy to reorient it towards another son. And just like somebody said something at that thing, I would love to know like what happened, because like even on his deathbed, and we talk about this in Oathbreakers too, like Louis the Pious, bishops are around him, he's lying, kind of, he knows he's dying, and the bishops are like, do you have anything you want to kind of get off your chest? Like, do you want to forgive your son and meet God with a clean conscience? And Louis the Pious is like, no,
thanks.
Screw that guy. Yeah. So something happened there. But what about you? Like, let's.
I just want to go to a Led Zeppelin concert circa 1969. And then I've thought about this before. Led Zeppelin, maybe Bob Marley.
Okay.
But then second, and maybe this is a segue of sorts, I don't know. I think I would go back to like see Jesus.
Okay.
I just want to check that out after the Led Zeppelin concert. In that order. Led Zeppelin first, Jesus second.
I mean, priorities. It is important to have priorities.
Yeah.
So, like, did you mention like kind of what era Led Zeppelin first? Let's start at the most important thing. So
maybe 1970,
Okay.
Yeah. Right around Led Zeppelin 3, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. I mean, the kind of standard answer would often be Led Zeppelin 4.
Yeah.
But
no. I'm a Led Zeppelin 3 guy.
You're a Led Zeppelin 3 guy. Okay.
Yeah.
That's always
my first cassette I ever bought, dating myself. Yeah.
Cassettes are, I mean, maybe I should do an explainer in a separate episode of what a cassette is. That's almost medieval history.
Seriously.
But okay, so Jesus. So because you are working on a project right now related to the cultural history of Jesus. So the way that Jesus has been understood throughout history. So is there a particular moment or anything, or just kind of in passing, you just kind of, in Bethlehem, in Jerusalem, Nazareth somewhere, you just like want to see him walk by, or do you want to see a particular event that has been retold through history?
That's a good question. Yeah. It'd be tough to know which events would be locatable in the past or not, I guess, first of all. But I don't know. Yeah, Sermon on the Mount seems like an easy one, but maybe raising Lazarus. I mean, that seems like a pretty big one.
Yeah.
Like what was going on with the raising of Lazarus from the tomb.
Sure. So just kind of see what the whole kind of vibe was. So how has that moment been kind of remembered? Because I think it's one that, most people, certainly most Christians, I would say, but even people kind of outside of the various traditions of Christianity, that they're kind of familiar with. It's for lack of a better term, kind of a marquee miracle of Jesus' ministry. So how has that been remembered? Like, how has that kind of been passed down?
Well, yeah, that question of memory, that's really what the project is about. I should explain. Some people might be wondering, I'm talking about Led Zeppelin and Jesus, like where are the Middle Ages in this, right? So you mentioned we've known each other for a while, right? So going back to graduate school back in around 1999, 2000 or so.
About that time, yep.
Yeah, so it's been a couple of decades, right? And during that period, I've been working on various topics related to the history of medieval Christianity, pilgrimage. My first book was on the Dominion of God, was on the Christian apocalyptic ideas and why those matter for the making of Western identity. Been really interested in popes, relics, different kinds of Christian devotion, and general Christian culture in like the history of ideas, but also Christian material culture, devotional practices. As you might imagine, Jesus comes up a lot, right? As you're exploring medieval Christianity, Jesus turns up a lot. And memories of his life turn up a lot. And I can sort of actually pinpoint, speaking of miracles in Jesus, when this project started to germinate in my mind, I was visiting the British Museum, and I'm sure you've been to the European Medieval History Room at the British Museum many a time.
I have indeed, many times.
And there's a point where you go in, right? And I don't know if have you ever seen the Tring tiles? Do you know about the Tring tiles?
I probably have, but the name isn't ringing a bell. Could you refresh my memory? So
you come in and like on this one wall are a series of glazed tiles, probably from Herefordshire from the 14th century.
Okay.
They're easy to miss. They're kind of pinned up on a wall as you kind of come into one of the doorways into the, and the Sutton Hoo Man, is right there. This like iconically famous Saxon, burial treasures. So it's easy to miss them, but they show scenes from the life of Jesus. And I distinctly remember there's maybe like 6 or 7 of them. A couple of the tiles are also at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I've had a chance to look at as well.
Okay.
They were split up. I was at the British Museum. I glanced. I was like, okay, great. Some scenes from the life of Jesus. And I noticed that they showed him as a child, as a kid, probably like 8, 9 years, 10 years old, right?
Mhm.
I almost walked away, but kind of paused and was like, wait a minute, I don't remember much in the Gospels about, Jesus being a teenager, basically, or a young child. And I took a closer look, and maybe you can imagine where this is going. The string tiles were representing parts of Jesus's life from the apocryphal infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is one of these books, apocryphal, or hidden or secret biblical texts that never made the
Yeah.
cut for inclusion into the canonical or official Bible, right?
But still hugely popular, right?
But hugely popular, not to be
Yeah, yeah,
confused with
yeah.
some of the Gnostic Gospels, which that would be a whole separate show, right? These Gospels
Yeah.
that became viewed as heretical by mainstream church authorities, and were like, some of them were literally buried in the desert in Egypt at Nag
Yeah.
Hammadi, where they were dug up in like 1945, and led to this kind of revolution in understandings of the diversity of ideas about Jesus. These apocryphal books I'm talking about, like the infancy Gospel of Thomas, were never deemed heretical per se. They were never banned. They weren't official enough to make it into the Bible, but they were really popular. And one
Mhm.
of them shows Jesus doing childhood miracles, right? Maybe I'd go back and check this out, actually, then, instead of the raising of Lazarus, where Jesus does raise. So, one example of raising someone from the dead, there's a neighborhood kind of bully. Jesus is playing by a stream. He's making some pools of water. The bully comes along and basically wrecks his pools of water. And Jesus, he basically gets like smote, smitten. He gets blasted dead,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
then his parents complain to Joseph and Mary, and Jesus brings him back to life with a kick in the ass, basically. And it shows it on the string tile. Jesus is kind of kicking him in the rear end and bringing this kid back to life. And so you get a vision of Jesus that is quite different from what you might get in the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that got me to wondering, like, wow, how are people remembering Jesus in the Middle Ages? What sort of stories are being told about him?
Yeah.
How is it being represented? And how did that change across the course of the Middle Ages? And what are those changes in ideas and visions of Jesus? What do they reveal, right, about medieval Christianity? So that was really the genesis of the project.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, so having taught for a long time in a religion department, one of the things that we often confront in our teaching and in the courses that I tend to teach is that the idea that religion is immutable and
Hmm.
unchangeable, that it hasn't changed. As trained historians, like, we always confront that things change over time, but religion being part of those things, that the idea of who Jesus was or the representation of him, I think, is sometimes difficult for people to kind of wrap their heads around, right?
I agree. Something else we have in common is we both teach at schools in the American South. I'm at, as you mentioned, Chapel Hill, and something I've noticed is that obviously we have students from all around the world, from like every different kind of background, but there's a considerable constituency of students who were raised in Southern households in some Christian background, usually have some passing, at least,
Mm.
familiarity, whether it's from like Sunday school or church or Veggie Tales. Veggie Tales, the
I do know
cartoons. But yeah,
VeggieTales, absolutely, yeah,
there's
yeah.
these sort of pop Christian educational stories and things like that, right? And so people will have a sense of who Jesus was, and of course, what Jesus might mean to them in the present in any given way, shape, or form is not my business as an historian. But part of my job as an historian is to then get them to think about the fact that the way they understand Jesus today as a cultural figure, as a religious figure, the way he's represented, talked about,
Yeah.
actually can be, as you know, radically different from the way he was understood in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the contextualized kind of representations, like you were saying, like those kinds of things matter. And, we're also confronting, I think, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but when people think about the Middle Ages and about kind of religion specifically, is that they do think about it kind of monolithically,
Yeah,
right? Is
yeah.
that, I mean, I remember like one of my first undergraduate courses on the Middle Ages, because that was the first time I really learned about the Middle Ages was in college, right? Like, maybe there was some mention in high school, but
You didn't go to the kids' library and read books on the Middle Ages? Man, I'm
no, I
shocked.
played with Legos of
Okay.
knights. That was my introduction, and I remember very distinctly signing up for my first medieval history course after I realized I was a failed anthropologist. I did not want to do anthropology because I thought, like, well, I played with Legos,
Legos.
sure, knights, castles, I know that kind of stuff. So, and
Great.
then it turned out to be quite different.
That's as good a reason as any.
I mean, yeah, like, why do people choose courses in high school or majors or something like that? So who knows? Sometimes they have good reasons, sometimes they have parental pressure, and sometimes they want to be Indiana Jones like I did. And they don't have haven't
Something
really
else we
thought
have in
about it.
common, but anyway,
There you go.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another kind of career aspiration. I have not made that. So I remember in the first one of the first lectures about the Middle Ages, like learning that like the early medieval Jesus was a certain way and the late medieval Jesus was another way. Kind of a relatively famous, at least for medieval historians, conceptualization of medieval religion from R.W. Southern, among others. Yes, but then there's a lot of nuance, and so this is a long segue to get back to the Apocrypha, which covers those. A lot of them, not all of them, of course, kind of cover the childhood, the teenage years of Jesus. Like when you're doing this research, like have you found the interest in the Apocrypha? Has that been kind of consistent across time? Is that something peculiar to the Middle Ages?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll sort of step back and explain how I wound up in the Apocrypha. I saw that 14th century representation
Yeah, yeah.
of apocryphal stories, which, right, that was like my first clue that these apocryphal stories were still circulating in the Middle Ages and were quite popular. And you mentioned R.W. Southern. I'll just jump in and flag. Yeah, there's this idea. I mean, going back, this is like in the 1950s in the making,
Mhm.
classic book, The Making of the Middle Ages.
I want to point out. Let me pause you for a moment. Neither of us are that old to have read it originally, but
No,
you know.
I don't remember, but I do remember that book was assigned when I was an undergrad at UVM. We
Oh yeah.
read
Oh yeah.
that book. So
Yeah.
it was still in the very early 90s. It was still out there. At that point, when I dove into the topic, I became aware of this argument, right? That Jesus during the early Middle Ages, so, post fall of Rome, and this is a podcast, so people can't see my scare quotes I'm making around fall of Rome. But
Sure.
this idea of, the end of the Roman world heading into the early Middle Ages was a period where Jesus was viewed as a kind of distant, sovereign
Mm.
power, Lord, a
Yeah.
savior suitable for the Dark Ages, so to speak, right? As a kind of a mysterious, distant figure, much like a king, ruling
Mhm.
from on far. And Southern argued that when you get to the 11th century, you start to see with figures like Anselm of Canterbury, this famous monk who's writing theological texts about the incarnation and why Jesus became a man, but also writing a series of emotionally laden prayers and meditations.
Mhm.
That Anselm's work is a signal of this new interest in the human side of Jesus Christ.
Yep.
This is what you're referring to before, right? Sometimes called the Southern thesis. And medievalists really ran with that idea over the past, 70 years at this point, that there's an outpouring of new interest in Jesus' humanity, which a lot of times involved a focus on his suffering, particularly. And there's been a
Mhm.
lot of medieval history written about representations of Christ as a suffering figure in the late Middle Ages. And some of the people listening to this podcast, if you've ever been into a museum collection of medieval European art, and you've seen one of these pictures of Jesus just like drenched in blood, right? Streaming down
Yeah.
his body, crown of thorns, prominently displaying the wounds in his hands and feet. You might have a sense of what I'm talking about. I should add, when I first thought of this project, I figured I would start around the 11th century and go up till around the end of the Middle Ages, say in the 1400s, and kind of re-engage with this idea of the human side of Jesus. But the more I did that, the more I kept getting sort of dragged back and interested in earlier medieval representations of Jesus, and realizing the idea that there was this absolute shift from a kind of an early medieval Jesus to like a higher late medieval Jesus, from an epic distant Jesus to a human one, wasn't really telling the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then needing to really understand even the medieval background to ideas of Jesus, I eventually was like, there's no way around it. I need to go back and start reading Christian apologetics from like the second, third century, and reading church fathers, right? And getting into the late ancient world of early Christianity. And then just recently, I figured, well, I've done 1,500 years at this point. So why not just go the extra 500 years and bring the project up to the present and do a new cultural history of Jesus, really over the last 2,000 years?
Mhm.
This is a long-winded way of getting back to your question. That like the Apocrypha, as an example, these Bible stories about Jesus' childhood are written back in like the second century, 50, 60 years after the canonical Gospels.
Mhm.
So in the
Mhm.
100s, they are in circulation in late antiquity. They get updated, they get revised. Thinking about the Carolingian era, there's the it's called the Proto Gospel of James, is another real popular
Mhm.
apocryphal story text. Dates to probably the second century. It details Mary's life. And by the way, when you're talking about medieval Jesus, Mary comes into the picture a lot, not
Oh
surprisingly.
yeah.
Talks about Mary's childhood, her conceiving of Jesus, and then adds all sorts of interesting details to the birth story of Jesus, like the presence of the ox and the ass that we always think of when you see the ox and the ass in those
Mm.
manger scenes. The ox and the ass are not mentioned in the canonical Gospels. Those come from the proto Gospel of James. It also features midwives that are involved, that Joseph grabs some midwives to help out with the birth, which is another thing you'll see in Christian representations of Jesus' birth scene throughout the Middle Ages into the early modern period,
Yeah.
right? So some of these elements from Pseudo James, which then gets updated in the Carolingian era in the 8th century, it's called the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew.
Mhm.
And it's basically a kind of expanded, revised version of the Gospel of James that gets produced in Latin. The original James is probably written in Greek and gets translated into like Syriac. And there's a lot of these apocryphal stories in like Coptic and Armenian and Arabic, right? So there's
Yeah.
a whole world of these early apocryphal traditions. And then this fuels into a whole Latin tradition of these stories, which also includes, of course, one of my favorites, the harrowing of hell, where Jesus goes down into hell and beats up on Satan and frees all the souls of the like righteous dead who are languishing in hell. And these remain popular all the way down to the early modern period. The Gospel of Nicodemus, this is the one that includes the story of
Mhm.
Jesus going to hell, is put on the index of prohibited books during the Catholic Reformation. So
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
16th century, right? So there's an
Yeah.
example, I think, when responding to Protestant critiques of Christianity as having all these, zany stories about Jesus and all this made up stuff. Martin Luther's like sola scriptura, scripture alone is the basis of faith, grace from God and scripture. And that's where I think you start to see a new concern with scripture alone being authentic, verifiable, real scripture, Matthew,
Mhm.
Mark, Luke, and John. And so I think you see, at least in some circles, a change in attitude towards the Apocrypha, recognizing it as actually not official, not worthwhile, kind of made up bizarre stories. But that doesn't mean it goes away. And I'll point out, you may or may not be aware, there's a new movie coming out. Nicolas Cage. Do you know about this movie? I can't remember the title off the top of my head. I just watched the trailer for it.
I'm intrigued already by Nicolas Cage, but sure.
Yeah, so I think he plays Joseph. It's a movie based on the infancy gospel of Thomas. It shows Jesus as a young child.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I wish I could remember the name. It's coming out, I think, later this year. And Nicolas Cage basically, he sees that his son has these powers and he doesn't know where they come from. And the devil, in the form of a young, sort of teenage girl, is showing up and seeing the young boy Jesus and tempting him already, and he's bringing things back to life. And this whole movie looks absolutely bonkers, but it is inspired by an apocryphal gospel, and it will be coming soon to a theater near you. So yes, these things do last.
The stories do last. I mean, it sounds like a subplot from The Righteous Gemstones, if you're familiar with that show.
Started the first season, have not continued, and I need to go back to it.
Okay, all right. You do need to go back to that because there's actually in the last season a subplot about Teen Jesus, which is called Teen Jesus in the show. So I sometimes life replicates art, I guess. But Nicolas Cage, I mean, I'm sure it'll be entertaining in its own way.
I believe it's called The Carpenter's Son. The Carpenter's Son.
Carpenter's Son.
So
Okay.
he's Joseph. Yeah, the
Okay.
Carpenter's Son.
And this is a real movie.
No, you have to be careful nowadays because there's all these fake trailers floating around.
Oh,
but
yeah.
to the best of my knowledge, this is a real movie. And I watched
Okay.
what seemed to be an official, not AI generated trailer. And
Okay.
and just to be clear, the whole time I'm working on this book, these sorts of cultural artifacts in the present and the way Jesus is coming up in terms of pop culture, political life, discussions around social values. Jesus is just kind of always there, right, in different ways, shapes, or forms. And so I'm very much always keeping one eye out for these contemporary present day questions around Jesus that are helping to shape my work. Right? I mean, medieval, thinking about American medieval, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is an example of how research on representations of Jesus in the Middle Ages led me on this broader research project that spans all the way back from basically, the first century up until today, because I really do see these connections, right, between the past and the medieval past and the American present.
Yeah, no, and I think especially kind of evocations of Jesus or representations of Jesus maybe is a better term that we see in kind of contemporary American political culture, but also kind of, social in society more generally. They're always kind of evocative of the past in some ways as well, right? Like they're calling on, or at least they're trying to evoke some sort of tradition, which can go back to the Middle Ages. It doesn't have to necessarily go back to the Middle Ages, but certainly has an antiquity to it in order to kind of counter claims that other people are making, on the other side of a political divide or another denomination or another part of the tradition. So, and I want to come back to that because I also want to talk about popes at some point. And, there's lots to talk about with popes nowadays.
Indeed.
Thanks for listening to our podcast, American Medieval. And if you like the show, that's great. It also means, however, that you'll like another of Multitude Show's, Spirits. Spirits is a history and comedy podcast focused on folklore, mythology, and the occult, told through the lens of feminism, queerness, and modern adulthood. Every week, mythology buff Julia and her childhood best friend Amanda get together to learn about a different story over drinks. That's everything from the mythological origins of franchises like Lord of the Rings and Wonder Woman to modern urban legends to a roundup of werewolf stories from around the world. Start listening with any of the more than 450 episodes they've released over the last 9 years. Dive in at spiritspodcast.com or search for Spirits wherever you download your podcasts. Now, back to the Middle Ages. Something you just mentioned, just kind of in passing, is the variety of languages that you're needing to work with in order to put this tradition. Because I think sometimes, and I certainly encounter this, and I'm sure you do as well, is that a lot of people's assumptions about the European Middle Ages is it's just Europe, it's just Latin. And that's just not the case, right?
That's right. And so, again, as you might recall, again, referring back to the fact we've known each other for a while, back to the graduate school days, the main research language I trained in, I believe this is the case for you as well, at first anyway, was Latin, right? To read these medieval documents in Latin. And of course, when you get to the later Middle Ages, you've got documents in Middle High German and French and Middle English. So
all the vernaculars start showing up, the European vernaculars. Yeah.
And, there's people writing in Saxon vernacular back in like Alfred the Great's time period. But Latin was the key research tool, particularly if you're interested in church history, right? I mean, whatever's going on with the vernacular, the vast majority of your documents are being written in Latin throughout the Middle Ages. But to your point, and I should be clear, I don't read Coptic or Armenian, but I figure at this point in my career that I hopefully gain the kind of leeway that I can responsibly work with sources in English translation, right? And that's what I'm doing, because I am well aware, and as my research has continued, that Christianity is very much a global phenomenon. Now, it's interesting, right? In the medieval era, let's say around the 11th century, Christianity plays a distinctive role in Western Europe and in the Byzantine Empire, for example, but also say in a place like Armenia, for example, where the ruling authorities over that society are Christian, right? This is where the idea of Christendom comes in to play, that you have these Christian societies where Christianity is the dominant religion and is the religion of the ruling elites who are in positions of power, be they like ecclesiastical or clerical, be they worldly powers like, kings or counts or emperors and figures like this, right? There are Christian communities in the Middle Ages throughout Persia, North Africa, the Middle East, and as far afield as Central Asia and into China, right? When you get to the later Middle Ages. So part of what I do want to do with the book, and I had the chance to go to Armenia just this last June, actually, and visit. Yeah, it was an interesting experience. I'd never been to that part of the world before, and I visited a number of these different monasteries that were typically, Armenia, as a lot of the listeners might know, the Armenian king, a kind of semi-legendary story. I mean, a lot of these stories of how kings convert are often semi-legendary, whether it's Constantine or Clovis or Tiridates, right? The Armenian king converted to Christianity. And historically, Armenia did become an area ruled by Christian kings in the 4th century, maybe even a little bit before Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor as we see him. So, visiting Armenia and traveling around visiting these monasteries was a great chance for me to really touch base with and encounter what you just said a minute ago, right? That we can't think of Christianity as an exclusively European phenomenon during the Middle Ages, or forget about the fact that large areas of Spain were, for much of the Middle Ages, majority Muslim, or that there were Jewish communities living throughout different parts of medieval, in Christendom, throughout the Middle Ages. But still, the idea of Christendom continues to fascinate me. The idea, not necessarily the straightforward historical reality, but the idea that you're in an environment where Christian values, Christian ideas, Christian institutions, and by the way, then ideas about Jesus Christ are really woven into the fabric of power and the fabric of political life in a way that sets the Middle Ages apart from what came before and what came after.
I think that's absolutely right, and it seems to make a lot of sense, and it's something that I mean, even just me, who my research kind of focuses almost exclusively on Western Europe, is just being attentive to the fact that even when we're talking about, like you said, kind of the 11th century, just for example, is that ideas about what it means to be a Christian, what theological questions are important, the resolutions to those questions, they are happening in vernacular languages, but mostly in Latin, but with also an attentiveness to texts that are being written in Arabic because of what's happening in Iberia, and a large percentage of Christians who are living under Islamic rule at that time, or just speaking Arabic as their native language. Greek, Armenian, Syriac, Coptic, all those languages of the Byzantine Empire at the same time, because the West is in constant contact, are very, very much aware of what's going on in Byzantium. And then, even a little bit later, especially like one of the largest, most powerful Christian kingdoms in the Middle Ages is in Ethiopia.
Yeah, down in
Right.
Nubia and Ethiopia. Yeah, that's right.
There's some wonderful research by Verena Krebs, who's done some work on that, about how like Ethiopian kings would send basically kind of tourists into Europe to look at this kind of backwater,
Right.
and kind
Right.
of report back about like, look at the Hicks up there, as opposed to our wonderful, powerful kingdom.
And I'll just jump in and add some of my more recent
please.
research in the 16th century. I'm just starting to dig in a bit more to this other moment where you see the Portuguese having at this point come around, the south tip of Africa, and getting up and encountering Ethiopians and having these discussions about their Christianity, where you've got, like, in the 16th century, this would be more early modern than medieval, right? And seeing this moment of exchange and encounter between Ethiopian Christians and European Christians as they're trying to like figure each other out, and in this different context of the Portuguese showing up, on the east coast of Africa in the 16th century.
Yeah, there's and I mean, the reality of kind of Christianity becoming a global religion, like a truly global religion,
Yeah.
oftentimes, and in fact, mostly kind of not in a really great way, like, forced conversions and European colonialism kind of
Yes.
bringing Christianity with it, but also encountering kind of native Christians that Europeans themselves kind of weren't aware of. I mean, Christians had been, and medievals were aware, of course, of like Christians in China,
Yes.
for example, because they sent missionaries out west, and there were Nestorians, that were Nestorian Christians who were there as well. But a reality of kind of the different varieties. And I'm wondering kind of how much does that fit into your research, or was there anything that kind of surprised you? Because, although Christendom as an idea, as kind of a unified community is extraordinarily powerful, there are different Christianities, right? Like
Indeed.
starting in antiquity and then continuing obviously through to today. So what surprised you about kind of the different ways that people thought about Jesus in different places and different times?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And so starting this project as someone trained in a Latin-based religious environment of the so-called Western Church or Roman Church, I was familiar with what we were talking about before, right? This idea of a growing emphasis on Jesus' humanity, for example, that Southern was talking about 70 years ago, and had seen different representations of Jesus in Western Christian art. As this project has unfolded, and this might not seem like a particularly surprising realization, but it's still an important one, I have become increasingly aware just of the diversity of different kinds of Christianity and visions of Jesus. And I should mention one book here is Yaroslav Pelikan's book, Jesus Through the Centuries, that is probably in some ways the closest to the project that I'm envisioning here. Came out in the 80s, and it does a kind of 2,000 year from the Bible up until the 20th century look at the figure of Jesus. And he talks about Jesus as a kaleidoscopic figure, right? And I think
that's an interesting kind of metaphor.
It
kaleidoscopic
is.
figure, yeah.
And Pelikan, I mean, he wrote all these books on medieval theology. I mean, he was like immensely old school learned, and I think was the sort of figure that from the inside out really had the deep-seated knowledge of the history of Christianity, way that really allowed him to explore ways that Jesus did change as a cultural figure across time and place. To your point before about kind of taking the good with the bad, I will say one of the reasons I want to write this book now, there's a couple of reasons. One is that Pelikan did incredibly admirable work, but he did have some blind spots, right? First of all, there is within Europe, one of the points of this book is that within Christendom, within Europe, within this period that might seem monolithic, right? Getting back to your point at the beginning of our talk, that, medieval Christianity is just kind of one thing. As you know, it wasn't, right?
Yeah.
There was all sorts of debates over Jesus and different ideas, different ways about carrying out your acts of devotion towards Christ. One example of that, of course, is this incredibly creative, important impulses of women's mysticism in the Middle Ages. When you read like Carolyn Walker Bynum's work, starting back in the 70s and then in the 80s, right? Starting in that period about women having particular kinds of devotional encounters or relationships with Christ, oftentimes focused on his body, on his blood, on these encounters of consuming or interacting with Christ in these very somatic or bodily ways, very distinctive. And like Pelikan never mentions that.
Wow.
And it's a big blind
that's
spot.
a blind spot.
And I'm thinking the book came out right around the time Kieran Walker Bynum's Holy Fast, Holy Feast came out, but her article on Jesus' mother was out, I think, in the 70s, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
scholarship was out there. Pelikan's book never mentions anti-Semitism, really.
That
I mean, yeah.
wow.
This is not sadly shocking that when you study the figure of
Yeah.
Jesus in medieval theology and devotional life, the possibility of anti-Semitism entering into the picture is just pervasive, right?
Yeah.
When you start talking about Christ, certain medieval sermon writers or theologians will then turn that into the direction of talking about, Jews collectively as enemies of Christ, right? So anti-Semitism is there just sort of constantly, and didn't come up in Pelikan's book. And then when you get into the modern period, and again, I'm not an expert, I'm rapidly trying to educate myself on contemporary Christianity in, say, the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries or after the present. But if you do a little bit of reading, you know too that the figure of Christ comes up around issues of race and identity in the modern period, the questions of white Jesus versus black Jesus, and these ideas of Jesus as a figure that might stand for the emancipation of slaves in the 19th century, South, or be invoked to defend slavery, which both sides of that argument were doing, right? And Pelikan doesn't really bring that up either. And of course, my final comment about this is that book was written in the 1980s. I think it was revised in the late 90s, but things have changed. I probably don't need to tell you. Things have changed politically in this country over the last 20, 15, 10 years. And so right away, I've been doing a lot of reading on the New Apostolic Reformation lately. Loose network of people whose discussions about Christianity will stray into discussions of Christian nationalism, right? And that this is a Christian nation, should be a Christian nation, and that the laws of this country should be patterned after biblical laws and God's laws. And there's a visibility of Christianity as it relates to questions of national identity now that I don't think we're really on the board in the same ways in the public sphere when Pelikan was writing this book. So all this is to say, you asked this question, I guess, that I did also, of course, become aware that figures of Jesus can be found not just in Europe, but really all around the world, right? I mean, there is a need to be attentive to this kind of global dimensions of Christianity. And that, if you want to see fast-growing Christian churches, go to Africa right now, right?
Sure.
And I still need to do more work on this, right? I want to know more about representations of Jesus in contemporary African Christianity, because I think there's a lot of interesting things happening there as well. So there's a global history here. There's a long-term history. And I think there's a history that I want to say in this book, right, that Jesus has inspired some sublime works of art, right? I had a chance to go to the Arena Chapel and see Giotto's early 14th century frescoes of the life of Christ, UNESCO World Heritage, amazing masterpieces. But then, as you know, you've studied the Crusades, right? In the late 11th century, people put crosses. And again, Pelikan doesn't really bring this up either, right? I don't think the Crusades really come up in the book. People put crosses on their clothing and start attacking Jews in the Rhineland and marching to Jerusalem, killing Muslims in the name of Jesus Christ. So you need to take that kind of capacious look at Christ's place in culture.
Yeah, no, and I think that there tends to be, when you're writing kind of larger histories like this, like I did with David in the Bright Ages, like you've done in some of your other works, like when you're taking kind of a meta view, a much longer view, is that there tends to be a flattening, right? And so it really needs to be a conscious attempt when you're talking about the Middle Ages generally, just to reveal the nuance that's actually there. And that goes back to kind of the monolith idea that we were talking about earlier in some ways. But then it becomes kind of hyper problematic when you get into kind of modern moments as well, when you're talking about kind of the way that people are remembering the past. There's kind of a double remembrance there, right? Especially when you're talking about things like Jesus, is that they're understanding the Gospels in a certain way, but that understanding of the Gospels is necessarily filtered through 2,000 years of tradition.
I'll jump in and say, or a deliberate attempt to kind of jettison those 2,000 years of tradition.
Sure.
Right?
Oh, yeah. No, of course.
And that's some of the reading I've been doing recently is just starting to familiarize myself with some of this like liberal Protestant writing from like the late 19th, early 20th century, which I'm starting to really clue into the fact that part of that mode of thinking about Christianity was very much trying to reconcile the Bible and Christianity with ideas of progress, with ideas of science, with impulses for social reform, right? So this is when I say liberal Protestantism, I mean that kind of like progressive era idea that Jesus is a social reformer who then can be enlisted to help make sure that kids aren't being forced to work underage in like factories or something like that, right? And there is this idea that this is a point where a lot of this liberal Protestant tradition is explicitly anti-dogmatic and sort of anti-creedal, right? That
Mm,
Jesus isn't about creeds of faith. Jesus isn't about theological abstractions. Jesus is about a kind of a lifestyle and a living presence in your life that you can kind of, and this starts to shade into more what we would call evangelical currents as well,
sure.
bringing Jesus into your heart, right?
Hmm.
And modeling your life after Jesus and not worrying about creeds like, say, the Nicene Creed
Yeah.
from 325 or the Chalcedonian Creed from 450, right? And so what I'm starting to see too is how a lot of these ideas, I'm glad you brought up the idea of the Middle Ages as a monolith, which, works in many different historical registers. But when it comes to the history of religion, the idea of a monolithic Middle Ages kind of under the tyranny of the Catholic Church,
Hmm.
where people just kind of mindlessly recite creeds of faith
Yeah.
without really thinking about what Jesus meant to them.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how some of that vision of that religious medieval monolith is really emerging out of late 19th, early 20th century liberal Protestant attempts to kind of sever that connection
Sure.
to that medieval past, which I find fascinating. And then, of course, Catholics have a whole different approach to trying to kind of stay connected with and preserve that sense of tradition. There's a fascinating filter there that visions of medieval Christianity are passing through in the 20th century.
No, no, absolutely. I mean, the Enlightenment was a thing. The romantic reaction to the Enlightenment, that was a thing,
Yes.
right? Like, and that
Yes.
impacted religion in all sorts of really interesting ways. I want to take a little bit of kind of a left turn, but I think it kind of builds off some of the stuff we've been talking about so far. Is because I'm in Virginia. You mentioned earlier, like you're in North Carolina. Like when you're talking about this, like in the community or just kind of teaching, because we're both teachers. Like we have lots of students that we work with. They come from kind of all over the place. Sometimes they're localized, sometimes they're from elsewhere. Like, how are they thinking about the Middle Ages? Do you sense that they're coming to this in North Carolina for you kind of with a set of presuppositions that you are having to kind of knock down? Or again, this kind of idea of the monolith, for example, or are they kind of much more kind of nuanced in their way of thinking about the past?
So I've been teaching at Chapel over 20 years, and I teach a large lecture class with, say, 150 students, and then I do some smaller seminars as well. And so I do feel like I can speak particularly to the student body. And I will say, like, I think by state law, it's like 80% of the students are from in-state,
Okay.
right? So
Hmm.
again, I mentioned that kind of demographic of a lot of the students are coming from in-state. Then of course we have international students from all around the world. But I do feel like I can generalize a bit about the sort of average student that shows up in one of my medieval history classes. And the truth of the matter is, despite amazing books like The Bright Ages, written by Matthew Gabriele and David Perry, we're never going to completely manage to dispel this lingering idea of the Dark Ages, right? And I think still, just from video games and YouTube videos and novels, television shows, what have you, this association of the Middle Ages with a kind of a level of barbarity, a sort of level of violence, of
Mm,
intolerance. And of course, the Middle Ages could be all those things, but the Middle Ages did not, unfortunately, have a corner on the market of, say, religious
yeah.
intolerance, right? And so, to your point about the subtlety, needing then to get students to kind of slow down and see medieval people as just as kind of real and in color, like as opposed to black and white television
Yeah.
show,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
This is like a fully embodied human beings, which to your point again, no, they didn't have jet engines, right? And they didn't drive around in automobiles. And I would not want to go to a medieval dentist. That these people were just as human, just as intellectual, just as complex. And students start to see it. And one of the reactions always is like, wow. I mean, if I had to boil down the reaction to teaching medieval history generally with that kind of student body, it's typically, wow, I had no idea the Middle Ages were so kind of interesting and
Yeah.
complicated. And I think part of this is, I have so much sympathy for our fellow educators in secondary school, particularly in public schools, where there's a lot of this sort of teaching to the test and a lot of
Sure.
requirements embedded in their teaching agenda. And the bottom line is, I'm sure people are really just struggling to get across basic history and historical understanding of U.S. history, let alone digging into the Middle Ages. But most students, and I think most Americans in general, don't receive much formal education about the Middle Ages at all, unless they go to college and then happen to take a medieval history
Yeah,
class.
yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, like, I've spent just a little bit of time kind of looking at state standards, for example, like in Virginia. Like, I mean, there's two kind of bullet points in ninth grade, mostly about feudalism and teaching what
Right,
feudalism is, which again, like sometimes medievalists call that the medieval F word, which is a really,
right.
it's a really problematic term in lots of different ways. But it understandably, perhaps it's kind of skated by. And yet, at the university level. And yet, as you said, like with video games, with kind of high fantasy books, with TV shows and stuff like that, like people are really interested in this particular period.
They are.
Right. And so, there's no place for them to kind of get this information in a classroom unless they are in a university where there are courses on the Middle Ages being offered, unfortunately.
There's a couple things going on. I mean, one is just kind of old-fashioned teaching of content, right? Just trying to familiarize people with
Sure.
with what medieval history was. But then I think the more interesting questions, as always, are to dig deeper and to think about some of the complexities of the medieval world and the way people thought, sometimes in some very different ways, right?
Mm.
Sometimes in some familiar ways and sometimes in some really different ways about the nature of politics. One theme that does interest me always is this broad question of how people navigate and negotiate what we would now call their political identities and their religious
Mhm.
identities. And I don't need to tell you, as a fellow medievalist, that the whole idea of dividing up human experience into politics and religion is very much a product of a kind of modern
Yeah.
way of looking at things,
Yeah.
right? And this is something I try to talk about with my students. And there still is this idea, I think, amongst your average student, again, that religion and politics like should be separate.
Mhm.
So there's something wrong with the Middle Ages because they aren't. And so this then opens up an interesting dialogue to talk about how differently the Middle Ages viewed the relationship between, ruling as a king and carrying out acts of religious worship. And then, of course, I'm like, you might also look at the world around you and see that the idea that there's some sort of clear delineation between people's politics and people's religion also is not borne out by, I think, what you see in the headlines around you. Speaking of international students, I've also had some fascinating exchanges with international students who have come to the United States from China.
Okay.
And they are not raised with, generally speaking, a kind of U.S. Southern Protestant inflected background, but really do actually have this idea that like there should be no religion at all in the public realm, basically,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's been kind of fascinating, a different intellectual exercise of the historical imagination to be like, I understand what you're saying, that you view this kind of absolute separation of religion from public life, but let's try to imagine a time back in the 12th
Yeah.
century when the relationship between religion and politics looked very, very different than what you're imagining. So regardless of the student's background or where they come from, typically they don't have a well-developed sense of what life looked like in the Middle Ages: intellectual life, cultural
Yeah.
life, religious life, political life. And that's where the fun conversations start to try to help guide them through that.
Yeah, I think that that's in some ways the most exciting part about teaching for me too, is when you get to that moment where it seems like we are in the classroom, teachers and students together are kind of exploring together, and you can kind of be more of a guide in that way about like, well, here's a primary source. What did they say? Like, what are they talking about? Like, okay, I understand the assumptions that you're bringing to this, and they're very understandable, but is that what the source is actually saying? And sometimes that could be really revelatory. Sometimes I just don't wanna do the reading, and that's totally fine, so
And that's the perennial problem from
yeah.
all of higher ed.
I mean, I was a student once, I didn't wanna always do the reading, so I understand that, but, yeah, sometimes when I'm a teacher, I don't even wanna do the reading. I probably shouldn't say that on my podcast, but, whatever.
Well, I'd
So,
like to think we have finely honed skimming abilities
we
after
do sometimes.
30 years of grooming our skimming skills.
Yes, whenever we have to go to a faculty meeting and need to read the packet or, some sort of committee meeting or something like that, that's when the skimming skills are really put to the test, so
That's right.
not about teaching. We would never skim on that, so.
Of course not.
No, of course not. All right. Well, we are unfortunately kind of running out of time. We've almost kind of hit an hour. This has been a really lovely conversation. One quick question though is that so what are you reading nowadays? Is there anything that you've been reading that kind of really has changed the way that you're thinking or kind of really reshaped your understanding of the medieval world generally?
I mean, I've been reading a lot about Jesus, as you might
Shocking. Yeah.
imagine. Yeah. I mean, in that regard, the reading's been really kind of scattered all over the place. I will mention I've been reading, I think it's Bruce Gordon's book, The Bible: A Global History,
Okay.
which is an interesting book, again, looking at the history of the Bible on a global scale from its origins up until the contemporary moment, and very much globalizing. There's chapters on, the King James Bible, but then talking about the Bible in like Africa and different parts of the world. And so that's been an interesting book. I also have been reading They Take It by Force,
Okay.
which is a book about Christian nationalism in the present moment. So, I'm taking the American part of American medieval pretty seriously in the sense that my views are less engaged with my current reading about visions of the medieval past, but again, trying to get a handle on some of these questions around religion, identity, and Jesus as they relate to the present, really.
Sure.
And so They Take It by Force is a book about, well, it basically is about January 6th, where some of the rioters had signs saying Jesus saves and
Mhm.
Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, right? And the author's basically exploring sort of from January 6th back to look at certain strands of evangelical Christianity in this country that have fueled the sort of Christian nationalist networks that seem to play a pretty important role in what happened that day in January 6th.
Yeah.
I can't remember. This is the problem with reading on your Kindle. I don't know the author's name off the top of my head because you don't see the book cover.
No, you don't have to page through it every time you open the book, right? So
No, so the author's name is not on the tip of my tongue because I blame my Kindle, but that's one of the other books I'm reading.
Oh, okay. I found too, like even when I'm doing kind of really highly specialized research on medieval period, is that reading widely is really helpful to me
Yes.
just to think about different ways of telling stories about the past, but also different ways of understanding the complexity of kind of people. And I think that that goes to teaching as well, is that I think it's very useful to show how people are complicated and messy and unpredictable, but understandable in all sorts of ways. Like the people in the past were no different.
That's it. That's right. And your comment just made me think about a third book, which Elaine Pagels had that book. Speaking of like complicated histories
Mm.
and really interesting people, Elaine Pagels, her book, I think it's again, the Mysteries and Wonder. It's a history of Jesus in a kind of biblical context,
Okay.
but really exploring again a kind of diversity of ideas about Jesus. And of course, Elaine Pagels has been a leading scholar on the subject of early Christianity and the Gnostic Gospels and things like this for 40 years. And so that book,
Oh,
which is
yeah.
a New York Times bestseller, and if I could get half of Elaine Pagels' readers to buy my book, I will be satisfied. So I am also trying to read these books that appeal to wider readerships
Sure.
and draw some inspiration from them.
Yeah. No, and I think that's part of the benefits of reading widely is like see who tells good stories, right? And thinking about kind of style. Historians, unfortunately, and not just medievalists, but historians generally, like we are pretty good storytellers, but we don't think about style and storytelling enough.
Well, we're trained a certain way.
We are indeed. We are
In
indeed.
grad school, and getting out of those habits of academic discourse can be challenging.
They can be challenging indeed. So,
But it's fun on podcasts, though, when you're just talking about stuff.
it is.
Kind of frees you up to talk about your work in less constrained ways.
Yes, chatting is good. So, and it's a great way to learn things. So, anyway, this has been a really wonderful conversation, Brett. If people do want to get in touch or to find out more about you, is there a way that they can do so?
I would say just Google Brett Whalen, Whalen. Brett with 2 T's, by the way, and UNC Chapel Hill History. My webpage will pop up, and then you can get my email.
You'll find your faculty webpage. Excellent.
That's exactly right.
Wonderful. So, well, we are looking forward to the book when it comes out. Brett is also the author of several other books on the papacy, which we didn't unfortunately have time to kind of talk about. So maybe we'll have you back at some point in the future. But until then, thank you so much, Brett, for joining us. And thank you ever for listening. And everybody have a great day.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schifini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/AmericanMedieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.